The wind in Wyoming Territory had teeth, and in the late autumn of 1889, it bit with a particular viciousness. It was a dry, scouring wind that lifted the topsoil from the plains and sent it spiraling into the air. A constant haze of grit that settled on every surface and in the back of every throat. The grasses were bleached to the color of old bone, brittle and rustling with a sound like whispering ghosts. Hugging this desolate expanse was the town of Dry Gulch, a place that felt less built and more like it had simply surrendered to the dust. A single main street connected a saloon, a livery stable whose scent of hay and horse sweat was a permanent part of the air, and a simple wooden chapel with a silent bell. The whole town seemed to hum with a new, metallic tension, a vibration that ran along the twin steel rails of the frontier and spur line, laid so close it felt like a threat. Nora Vale felt the grit on her eyelids as she adjusted the heavy tripod. Her hands, chapped from the arid air and the chemical tang of her photographic solutions, moved with a practiced economy. At 27, she had learned to make her movements small and deliberate, to conserve energy against a world that always seemed to demand more than it gave. She pulled the black focusing cloth over her head, and the noisy, sun-blasted world of Dry Gulch vanished, replaced by an inverted, silent image on the ground glass. The world made more sense this way, upside down and contained within a frame. Here, she could control the light, the composition, the story. Her glass plate camera was a heavy, cumbersome thing, a box of mahogany and brass that captured truth one fragile, silver-coated pane at a time. It was her shield and her weapon, the reason she had left a life of suffocating expectations in the East for this land of raw, unforgiving honesty. She was here to document the railroad's march, to capture the story of progress for a New York paper. But the whispers she heard in places like Dry Gulch spoke of a darker narrative, one of coercion, stolen land, and the crushing of small lives under the weight of iron and money. Her focus found him then, a man walking out of the livery, leading a buckskin mare that moved with a quiet grace. He was not like the other men in town, the loud, swaggering cowboys or the tight-lipped merchants. There was a stillness about him, a way of moving that seemed rooted to the land itself. He was tall, with the lean, hard build of a man who spent more time in the saddle than at a table. His dark hair was tied back with a leather thong, and his face, weathered and angular, held a history she could not read, but it was his eyes that held her focus. They were dark and watchful, missing nothing. He paused by the water trough, letting his horse drink, and his gaze swept the street, lingering for a second on her and her strange machine before moving on. He wore a simple work shirt and denim trousers, and on his hip, a sheathed knife with a worn wooden handle rested with an easy familiarity. It was not a fighter's knife, but a tool. A thing for shaping the world, not just for threatening it. That man was Eli Hart. At 35, he carried the weight of two worlds and felt fully at home in neither, the son of a Cheyenne woman and a white trapper. He had learned the silence of the plains from his mother and the harsh pragmatism of survival from his father. He had scouted for the cavalry, a life that had left scars deeper than the one that cut a thin white line through his left eyebrow. Now, all he wanted was the piece of land his father had left him, a small, defensible valley he called Hart's Pocket. It was the only place he felt his soul could breathe, but the land carried a debt, a piece of paper in the town records that felt like a noose tightening with every passing season. The railroad wanted his land, not for the tracks themselves, but for the water rights that came with it. And Eli knew men like Silas Morrow. The railroad's smooth-talking agent did not ask twice. He ran a hand along his mare's neck, the coarse hair of her mane a familiar comfort. He had seen the woman with the camera when she first arrived a week ago. An Easterner, clear from the cut of her clothes and the determined set of her jaw. He had heard the talk. She was a newspaper writer, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Questions about land deeds and sudden fires and ranchers who had packed up and left in the middle of the night. He saw her as another complication, another gust in the relentless wind. Yet, there was something in her stance, a refusal to bend to the elements, that pricked at his own weary resolve. He watched her duck under the black cloth, a strange, vulnerable gesture that seemed at odds with the strength in her shoulders. He told himself it was none of his business. His only goal was to earn enough leading a cattle drive south to pay off the note on Hart's pocket. He needed to find his own peace, not get tangled in someone else's war. Later that day, Nora sat in the common room of the boarding house run by May Hollis. The place smelled of boiled coffee, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of May's apple pie. May was a woman whose kindness was as practical as the apron she always wore. A widow who had seen enough of life's hardships to know that sympathy was cheap, but a hot meal and a clean bed were currency you could count on. She moved around the room with a sturdy grace, refilling coffee cups and offering a word of encouragement here, a sharp observation there. Nora carefully polished a fresh glass plate, her reflection wavering in the slick, collodion surface. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, a cold, familiar companion. She had a letter in her valise, an anonymous note that had been slipped under her door in Cheyenne. It spoke of a man named Silas Morrow and a pattern of intimidation orchestrated by the Frontier and Spur Company, all under the compliant eye of the local law. The letter was a lead, but it was also a danger. Her past had taught her the cost of provoking powerful men, a life she had barely escaped, one that had left her with a deep-seated mistrust of promises and a flinching memory of a raised hand. Danny Pike, a boy of 15 with eyes that were too old for his face, knelt by the hearth, working a shine into a dusty pair of boots. An orphan, he survived on his wits and the small kindnesses of people like May. His ears, however, were his greatest asset. They were finely tuned instruments, picking up the scattered whispers and guarded conversations that floated through Dry Gulch like thistle down. He glanced over at Nora, his expression one of sharp, youthful curiosity. He said that he had heard Sheriff Kane telling some of the ranchers that the railroad was the key to their future, a blessing they should welcome with open arms. May, overhearing him, made a small, skeptical sound as she set a slice of pie in front of Nora. She leaned in, her voice low. "In this town," she said, "people who open their mouths too wide often end up losing their homes." It was a warning, delivered with the same practicality as the pie. From the window, Nora could see the sheriff, Luther Kane, standing on the boardwalk. He was a big man who filled his uniform, projecting an aura of unflappable authority. He smiled and nodded to the townsfolk, the very picture of a dedicated public servant. But Nora saw the way his eyes, cold as river stones, scanned the street, missing nothing. She had seen him talking to a man in a fine Eastern suit a few days prior, their heads close together in a conference that was too quiet, too intimate for a simple chat. She suspected this was Silas Morrow. Sheriff Kane was supposed to be the law, but Nora was beginning to understand that out here, the law was just another tool, something to be bought and wielded. Eli saw the same conversation. He was across the street, securing a new cinch on his saddle. He recognized the tailored suit and polished boots of the railroad man, a species he had come to despise. He watched Kane laugh, a hearty, false sound that did not reach his eyes. Eli's hand rested on the hilt of his skinning knife. It was a simple tool, given to him by his father, who had taught him how to read a trail, how to respect a kill, and how to know when to stand your ground. His father had told him that a man's worth was measured by what he chose to protect. Right now, Eli felt he had very little left to protect besides his land and his solitude, and both felt as fragile as a dry leaf. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a raw, beautiful spectacle that did little to warm the cooling air. Nora felt a pull, an artist's compulsion to capture the fleeting light. She packed her kit and walked to the edge of town, to a small rise that overlooked the vast, darkening plain. The new railroad signal post, a stark black crucifix of wood and metal, stood silhouetted against the dying sun. It was a symbol of the future, stark and unyielding. She set up her tripod, her movements sure and steady in the fading light. This would be a long exposure, a slow gathering of information. As she prepared the plate, she became aware of a presence nearby. It was Eli Hart. He was standing by a small cluster of cottonwoods, his mare grazing peacefully beside him. He was not looking at her, but out at the same horizon, his profile carved against the incandescent sky. He seemed a part of the landscape, as ancient and enduring as the hills. She ducked under the cloth. The world flipped, the fiery sky becoming a sea of molten gold at the bottom of her frame. The signal post was a black gash, a wound in the heavens, and there, off to the side, was the faint, ghostly silhouette of Eli Hart. He was a shadow in the light, a quiet observer on the edge of her story. She hesitated for a moment, then uncapped the lens. The glass plate began its silent work, drinking in the light, the dust, the color, and the man. It was a picture of a sunset over Wyoming, but it was also a picture of a world on the brink. The sun, a perfect circle of fire, seemed to fall directly into the signal's crossing arms, a sacrifice to the coming age of steam and steel. And in the deepening twilight, the shadow of the lone man stood watch, a silent question against a sky full of fading promises. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a light, a hungry orange flicker that pulsed against the deep indigo of the Wyoming night. Miles from town. Eli Hart saw it from the porch of his small cabin in Hart's Pocket. He had been sitting in the dark, letting the cool air settle the dust of the day. When the unnatural dawn bloomed on the horizon, it was in the direction of the Vargas homestead. He was moving before the thought had fully formed, throwing a saddle on his buckskin mare, Cinder, his motions fluid and economical in the moonlight. He did not waste time on speculation. Fire on the prairie in late autumn was a death sentence. By the time Nora Vale heard the shouting on the street, the glow was visible from her window at the boarding house. Men were running, their voices tight with alarm. She grabbed her satchel. The familiar weight of her lenses and chemical bottles a strange comfort. Her first instinct was the story. Her second was the heavy box of her camera. It was a foolish, cumbersome thing to bring to a disaster. But it was the only way she knew how to make sense of chaos, to frame it, to hold it still, to find the truth inside the noise. She arrived breathless on the edge of the Vargas property, the heat of the blaze pushing her back. The main barn, a repository of a full season's grain and the family's hope for the winter, was engulfed in a roaring column of flame. Sparks shot into the sky like a swarm of angry fireflies, and the sound was a living thing, a continuous, deafening roar of consumption. The air was thick with the smell of burning pine and roasted grain, a sickening perfume of ruin. Men formed a ragged line, passing useless buckets of water from the well, their faces grim in the hellish light. Then she saw it, through the swirling smoke, on the far side of the barn, away from the futile efforts of the bucket brigade. A figure, a man, silhouetted against the inferno. He was watching, still as a statue, and the shape of his hat was distinct, a hard, flat brim, not the soft felt of a cowboy's. Her hands moved with a life of their own, her mind a cool, detached engine of process. Tripod legs extended, camera mounted, plate holder slid into place. She worked under her focusing cloth for only a second. The image on the glass, a terrifying, beautiful miniature of the disaster. She pulled the dark slide, uncapped the lens, and threw the magnesium powder into her flash pan. A brilliant, silent detonation of white light bleached the scene for a split second, followed by a puff of acrid smoke. She hoped it was enough. She hoped she had caught the ghost. A woman's scream cut through the roar of the fire. It was Mrs. Vargas, her face a mask of terror. "My husband!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling hand toward the smaller stable adjoining the main barn. He went back for the horses. Eli arrived then. Cinder lathered from the hard ride. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped, his eyes taking in the scene with a scout's practiced assessment. The main barn was lost. The stable was not yet fully ablaze, but smoke, thick and black, poured from its eaves. He saw the despair on the faces of the bucket line and the raw panic in Mrs. Vargas's eyes. A memory, hot and sharp, flashed behind his eyes. The memory of another fire, of men screaming, the smell of burnt wool and something worse. He felt a cold knot of dread in his gut, a voice that told him to stay back. That fire was a beast that devoured everything. Then he saw the stable door swing on one hinge, a dark mouth vomiting smoke. The instinct to act, older and deeper than the fear, took over. He grabbed a wet cloth from a dropped bucket and tied it over his nose and mouth. He ran toward the stable, his steps sure and even. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall he had to push through. Inside, it was a blind, choking hell. The terrified whinnies of horses were sharp with pain. He found Miguel Vargas on the ground, overcome by the smoke, a half-dead weight of a man. Eli slung one of Vargas's arms over his shoulder, his own lungs burning, his eyes streaming. He hauled him out, dragging him into the open air just as a section of the stable roof collapsed in a shower of embers. He laid the older man on the ground, away from the heat, and turned back. He slapped the rumps of the two panicked horses, sending them galloping out of the collapsing structure and into the night. By the time Sheriff Luther Kane arrived, the main barn was a smoldering skeleton. The fire had been contained, but the damage was absolute. Miguel Vargas was sitting up, coughing a thick, racking cough, but alive. Eli stood nearby, his face smudged with soot, his knuckles raw. He was watching Nora, who was carefully packing away her exposed glass plate. Kane strode into the center of the scene, his presence large and authoritative. "A terrible accident," he declared, his voice booming with manufactured sympathy. "A stray ember from the kitchen stove. No doubt. The wind does the rest." He clapped a hand on Vargas's shoulder. "The town will help you rebuild. Miguel, we look after our own." The sentiment rang hollow in the smoky air. Nora met Eli's gaze across the yard. She saw in his quiet watchfulness the same doubt she felt. Kane's eyes found her then, and his practiced smile tightened. "Miss Vale," he said, his tone shifting from paternal to predatory. "Taking pictures at a time like this, a bit ghoulish, wouldn't you say?" "It is my job to document events, Sheriff," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am sure it is, but this is now an official investigation. As such, any potential evidence belongs to my office. I will take that photographic plate." He held out a hand, not asking, but demanding. Nora clutched the wooden plate holder to her chest. "This is my property, Sheriff." "It is evidence in a tragic accident. Hand it over, or I will be forced to place you under arrest for interfering with an officer of the law." Eli took a step forward. The movement was small, almost casual, but it changed the geography of the clearing. He was now standing between the sheriff and Nora. "She is not interfering with anything, Kane," he said, his voice low and calm. "The fire is out. The man is safe. Let her be." Kane's face hardened. "Hart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This does not concern you. Go play the hero somewhere else. We all know how you like to get involved in other people's troubles." The words were a clear reference to his Cheyenne blood, a subtle poison meant for the ears of the assembled townsfolk. Eli did not flinch. He simply stood his ground, a silent, immovable object. He looked at Nora. "Keep your plate," he said. Anger flashed in Kane's eyes. He lunged, not at Eli, but at Nora, his big hand grabbing for the plate holder. She recoiled, twisting away. The holder slipped from her grasp. It hit the hard, packed earth with a sickening crack. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Nora knelt, her heart sinking. The mahogany frame was split, and the glass plate inside was shattered. Kane straightened up, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "A shame," he said. "Now I suppose we will never know what was on it." He turned and walked away. resuming his performance as the concerned lawman, leaving Nora kneeling amidst the fragments of her work. Tears of frustration and fury pricked her eyes. She carefully picked through the pieces, her fingers brushing away the dirt. Most of it was a spiderweb of useless cracks, but one large shard remained intact. She held it up to the flickering firelight. It was the edge of the frame, and on it, faint but unmistakable, was the dark silhouette of the figure, his form cut off, but the clean, sharp line of his hard-brimmed hat was perfectly, damningly clear. Back at the boarding house, the smell of smoke clung to her clothes and hair. She sat at her small table, the shard of glass wrapped in a soft cloth. She wanted to send a telegram to her editor immediately, to expose the fire for what it was, an act of deliberate intimidation. But a cold fear held her back. The face of her former fiancé, Edwin Roque, swam in her memory. He was a lawyer, a man who used words and the law itself as weapons. He had twisted her confidence into fear, her love into a cage. When she had finally found the courage to leave, he had threatened to ruin her, to circulate lies and manufactured scandals that would destroy her reputation. She had run, but she knew men like Edwin did not forget. They tracked you. The thought of drawing that kind of attention to herself again made her feel physically ill. She was a strong woman, but she knew how easily a man with power could break a woman who had none. As she looked out her window, she saw him, a tall, thin man standing in the shadows across the street. He was doing nothing, just watching her window. She had seen him before, near the railroad office, and she remembered the faint, sharp smell of coal tar that seemed to cling to him. He was one of Morrow's men. They were watching her. The threat was no longer a vague notion in an anonymous letter. It was here. Eli found a quiet corner in the livery stable, the familiar scent of hay and horses calming his frayed nerves. He hated this. He hated the pull of other people's battles. He had come back to Wyoming seeking silence, not conflict. He knew what men like Cain could do to someone like him. They would use his heritage as a weapon, painting him as a savage, an untrustworthy half-breed, using the town's latent prejudice to isolate and discredit him. It was easier to stay quiet, to keep his head down, to focus on his own small piece of the world. But he could not erase the image of Miguel Vargas's face, gray with smoke and despair. He could not forget the sound of the glass plate shattering, or the defiant look in Nora Vale's eyes as she stood up to the sheriff. He was not a hero. He was just a man who could not stand by and watch a bully kick a dog, or a powerful man crush a small one. It was a flaw, he supposed, a flaw that was about to get him into a great deal of trouble. The town settled into a tense, watchful quiet. The whispers grew louder. It was an accident. The Vargas family was careless. They had it coming. Nora heard May Hollis murmur to Preacher Bell in the common room. "In this place," May said softly, "you can lose your home for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time." It was a confirmation of everything she feared. Late that night, after cleaning and reassembling her camera, Nora placed a new, larger lens into its brass fitting. She had made a decision. Fear was a cage, and she had spent too long living in one. She looked out her window. Down below, in the moonlit street, a figure stood by a buckskin mare. Eli Hart was waiting. He was not looking up at her window, but out toward the dark line of the horizon, where the railroad tracks gleamed under the stars. He was waiting for her. She packed a fresh set of plates, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. They had not spoken a word, but they had an agreement. The truth did not lie in the ashes of the Vargas barn. It was out there, in the darkness, where the railroad men worked under the cover of night, and they were going to find it. They left before dawn, two riders moving as one into the vast, gray emptiness of the prairie. There was no discussion, no formal agreement. Eli had been there, waiting, and Nora had come down the boarding house stairs, her heavy camera kit safely stowed in a padded leather case strapped behind her saddle. The air was cold enough to see their breath. two white plumes mingling in the dark. As they passed the livery, a small figure darted from the shadows. It was Danny Pike. He carried his shoe-shine box, a pretense of work at an hour when no one needed a shine. He fell into step beside Eli's horse, his voice a low, urgent whisper that was nearly lost in the wind. "I was cleaning up in the saloon last night," he said, not looking up from buffing an imaginary spot on Eli's boot. "That railroad man, Morrow, was talking to the sheriff. I heard Morrow's name and something else, a password. Maybe he told Kane to tell their man to scratch milestone 32 when the job was done." Eli's expression did not change, but Nora saw his hand tighten on the reins. He reached into his pocket and pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "Be careful, Danny," was all he said. The boy nodded, melting back into the shadows as they rode on, the name and number hanging in the air between them. Milestone 32. It was a destination. Their trail was less a path and more an idea, a faint trace of coal tar on the wind that only Eli seemed able to follow. It led them away from the main routes, into a landscape of eroded buttes and dry creek beds. They passed a small, temporary depot the railroad had thrown up, little more than a shack and a water tower. 100 yards from the main building sat a shed, its door secured by a padlock that looked laughably inadequate. Through the gaps in the planking, Nora could see wooden crates stenciled with a stark warning, "Dynamite." It was left almost unguarded, a testament to the railroad's arrogant carelessness. They owned the land. They owned the law. Why should they worry about a few tons of explosives? By midday, the sky had turned a sickly yellow. The wind, a constant companion, began to howl, picking up speed and fury. It drove the dust into a solid, moving wall that blotted out the sun. A dust storm, sudden and violent. "There is a rock overhang just ahead," Eli shouted over the roar. "We can wait it out there." He urged Cinder forward, Nora following close behind, her bandana pulled up over her nose and mouth. The air was a choking, blinding chaos. The shelter was a shallow scoop out of a low cliff face, barely enough to protect them from the worst of the wind. They dismounted, huddling together with the horses, who stood with their tails to the storm, heads lowered. The grit was everywhere, a fine powder that worked its way into their clothes, their hair, their mouths. Nora shivered, not from the cold, but from the sheer, elemental power of the storm. Eli, without a word, shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. The coat smelled of leather, horse, and him. It was a surprisingly intimate gesture. The sudden proximity in the small space was charged, a bubble of quiet in the heart of the gale. He was close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the texture of the old scar on his brow. To break the tension, she tried for a light tone. "Thank you. This is better than being sandblasted." He gave a small, wry smile. "We aim to please." The wind howled, pressing them closer together. She watched his hands as he checked the horse's tethers. They were capable hands, scarred and competent. Hands that could calm a spooked animal, drag a man from a fire, or hold a rein with unshakable steadiness. She felt a flicker of something warm and unfamiliar, a feeling she had long since taught herself to mistrust. As they rode, they talked, their conversation piecing together the grim puzzle. They spoke of Silas Morrow, a man who moved through the territory like a phantom, leaving a trail of broken contracts and abandoned homesteads. They spoke of Sheriff Kane, whose legal maneuverings always seemed to pave the way for Morrow's acquisitions. And Eli mentioned a name he had heard whispered among disgruntled railroad workers, a man known for his willingness to do any job, no matter how dirty, Harlan Twig. A man who, it was said, could make a fire look like an accident. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered coulee. The wind had died down, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and a sky littered with 1,000,000 stars, while Eli built a small, smokeless fire. Nora set up her camera, pointing it toward a distant railroad signal lamp, a single, unwavering point of light in the immense darkness. She was going to attempt a long exposure, leaving the lens open for hours to gather the faint starlight and the lone signal. It was as much an act of art as it was of journalism, a belief that some truths only revealed themselves over time, in the patient gathering of light. Eli watched her, his own internal conflict stirring. He wanted her safe. He wanted her back in Dry Gulch, away from men like Morrow and Twig. But he saw the fierce concentration on her face, the way her hands moved with such purpose. This was not just a job to her, it was a calling. To tell her to stop would be to ask her to be someone else, someone less than who she was. He had lost people before, people he had tried to protect. The fear of that happening again was a cold stone in his stomach. "You make coffee like you are trying to punish the beans," she said, taking a cautious sip from the tin cup he handed her. It was a dark, bitter brew that tasted of scorched metal. He sat down across the fire from her. "It is supposed to clean out your insides," he said, his face perfectly serious. "Gets rid of any lingering kindness or optimism." She laughed, a clear, bright sound in the quiet night. "Well, it is certainly working. I feel more cynical already." The easy humor was a balm, a way to navigate the growing connection between them without naming it. They were two solitary people, brought together by a shared sense of justice, finding a strange comfort in each other's presence under the vast, uncaring sky. 2 days later, they returned to Hart's Pocket. The first thing Eli saw was the notice, a square of cheap paper, nailed brutally to his front gate. The words, printed in stark, official type, swam before his eyes. Condemnation notice. By order of the Wyoming Territorial Authority and the Frontier and Spur Railroad Company, the property was to be ceded for public use. He had 5 days. Nora saw the life drain from his face, replaced by a cold, still anger that was more frightening than any shout. He swung down from Cinder and walked to the gate, his movements stiff. He ripped the notice from the wood, the nail screeching in protest. He crumpled the paper in his fist. "This is how they do it," he said, his voice a low growl. "They burn a man out, and if that does not work, they bury him in paper." Nora dismounted and walked to stand beside him. She looked past the gate, into the small valley. It was not prime land, but it was his, near the cabin. She saw a small, fenced-off area where a dozen young apple trees stood in neat rows. They were scraggly, struggling against the harsh wind and poor soil, but each one was staked and clearly tended with care. She understood then. Hart's Pocket was not just a piece of dirt he owned. It was a place he was trying to build something, to make something grow in a land that was determined to stay barren. It was about self-respect. "We will fight this, Eli," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised her. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He gave a single, sharp nod. That afternoon, they rode out again, following the railroad line south. The condemnation notice had given their search a raw, personal urgency. They counted the milestones, the stout wooden posts that marked each mile of track, 29, 30, 31. They found milestone 32 standing alone near a deep cut in the landscape. And just as Danny had said, its surface was marred by a series of deep, deliberate scratches, a crude signal gouged into the wood. The ground around the post was scuffed and trampled. Eli dismounted, his eyes scanning the earth like he was reading a book. He pointed. There. It was a single boot print, partially obscured by grass, but the heel was clear in a patch of damp earth, and stuck to the heel was a smear of something black and tacky. Coal tar. Nora knelt beside it, her reporter's mind clicking through the connections. The man at the fire, the watcher outside her window, a man who worked for the railroad. As she looked closer, she saw something else, half hidden under a clump of sagebrush. She reached out and carefully picked it up. It was a small wooden matchstick, the kind that came in a box, not the loose sulfur matches most cowboys carried. And on the flattened end of the stick, printed in faded red ink, was a tiny, intricate logo. It was the snarling face of a devil, complete with tiny horns and a pointed beard, a brand, a calling card, a piece of the truth, small enough to hold between her fingers. The piece of devil-stamped wood felt both weightless and immensely heavy in Nora's palm. It was proof, tangible and real. But as they rode back toward Dry Gulch, a cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Proof was only as powerful as the law that backed it, and she had seen enough to know that Sheriff Kane's law was a crooked and selective thing. They found him waiting for them, not at Hart's Pocket, but in the middle of the main street as they rode into town. He stood with his feet planted wide, a leather satchel in his hand, his face a mask of official regret that did not quite reach his eyes. He had 2 deputies with him, their hands resting near their sidearms. "Eli Hart," Kane said, his voice carrying easily in the still afternoon air. "I have an order of seizure for your property." Eli reined Cinder to a halt, his body going rigid. "The condemnation notice." "Oh, this is not about the railroad's needs," Kane said with a dismissive wave. "This is a simple matter of civic duty. It seems you are delinquent on your territorial property taxes. Severely delinquent. In fact," he pulled a sheaf of papers from the satchel, "a lien has been placed on Hart's Pocket. The property and all its assets will be impounded until the debt is paid in full." What debt? Eli's voice was dangerously quiet. "I have paid my taxes every year. I have the receipts." "According to the Territorial Assessor's Office." "You do not," Kane replied, his smile widening. "It is all right here. Signed and sealed. A clerical error, I am sure, but a binding one. The property is forfeit in 3 days' time." He held the papers out. It was a trap, elegant in its bureaucratic cruelty, a lie. Born in a back office in Cheyenne at Silas Morrow's request. Now given the full force of law, it was a paper cage, and Kane was the one holding the key. Nora felt a surge of cold fury. Back at the boarding house, she paced the length of her small room, the floorboards groaning under her restless feet. "We have to get the story out," she said to May Hollis, who was calmly mending a torn sheet by the window. "I can write it all up. The fire, the intimidation, this fraudulent tax bill. I will send it to the Cheyenne paper on the evening stage." May did not look up from her sewing, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic stitch. "The stagecoach has a way of getting delayed out here," she said, her voice even, "and packages have a way of getting lost, especially packages addressed to newspapers. Morrow has ears everywhere. Child, the man who drives the stage owes the saloon a great deal of money. The saloon is owned by a man who owes Morrow a great deal of favors. It is a spider's web." The sense of being trapped intensified. The law was a weapon against them. The mail was a dead end. Every conventional path to justice seemed to be blocked. It was then that she heard it, the distinct rumble and jingle of the daily stage from the east, pulling up in a cloud of dust in front of the boarding house. Voices drifted up from the street, the usual commotion of arrival. But then a man's voice, cultured and smooth, with the crisp accent of the East, cut through the noise. It was a voice she had prayed she would never hear again. Her blood ran cold. She moved to the window, her limbs feeling heavy and slow, and looked down. Standing there, handing his fine leather valise to a boy, was a man in a perfectly tailored woolen suit, his boots polished to a mirror's shine despite the dust. He looked utterly out of place, a creature from another, more refined world, and he was looking directly up at her window. Edwin Roque, her former fiancé, the architect of her flight, the ghost she could never quite outrun. For a moment, she could not breathe. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that he had always mistaken for charm. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture of mock chivalry, before turning to enter the boarding house. Nora backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. He could not be here, not now. It was an impossible coincidence. Unless, she realized with a sickening lurch, it was not a coincidence at all. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, but before she went downstairs, her hand went to her trunk. She pulled out a length of silk, a scarf the color of a wild rose. It was a small thing, an indulgence she had bought for herself in Cheyenne, a splash of defiant color in her practical world. She tied it around her neck, the soft fabric a strange comfort against her skin. It felt like armor. She found him in the common room, already charming May Hollis, who looked less than charmed. Eli was there, too, standing by the hearth, a cup of coffee in his hand. He had seen the way Nora flinched at the window, and he had come over from the livery, a silent, watchful presence. "Nora, my dear," Edwin said, turning to face her. His eyes, the color of pale blue ice, swept over her, taking in her simple dress, the determined set of her jaw. "You look, well, rustic." The word was meant as an insult, a reminder of the elegant world she had abandoned. "What are you doing here?" "Edwin," she asked, her voice tight. "I could ask you the same thing. I was so worried when you disappeared. Imagine my surprise when my firm was retained by the Frontier and Spur Railroad for a small legal matter in this charmingly primitive territory. And I heard a certain female photographer was making a nuisance of herself." He took a step closer. His cologne, a scent she had once loved, now smelled cloying and false. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was aware of Eli, still and silent by the fire, his presence a dark, grounding weight in the room. "This has nothing to do with you, Edwin." "On the contrary," he murmured, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "It has everything to do with me. You are in over your head, my dear. These are dangerous men. You should pack your little camera and come home. I can protect you." "Protect me?" The word was so absurd it almost made her laugh. "From what?" "From yourself, Nora. From your unfortunate impulses. And from misunderstandings." He let the word hang in the air, freighted with the weight of his old threats. He was talking about the photographs he had taken of her in private. Moments of intimacy he had sworn to twist into a public scandal if she ever left him. A deep, familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. It was his greatest weapon against her, that feeling of being soiled, of being unworthy. She straightened her shoulders, her hand going to the red scarf at her throat. "I am not going anywhere with you." Edwin's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of the cold anger she knew so well. "Do not be a fool. You cannot win this. You will only get yourself hurt, or worse, ruin your reputation permanently. Think of what people would say." That was when Eli moved. He did not say a word. He simply walked from the hearth and stood behind her. He did not touch her, did not speak for her. He was just there, a solid, unmovable presence at her back. His nearness was a silent declaration. "You are not alone." Edwin's gaze shifted to Eli, taking in the worn denim, the Cheyenne features, the knife on his belt. His lip curled in a dismissive sneer. "And who is this your local guide?" Eli's eyes were flat and hard. "The lady does not seem to want your company," he said. His voice was calm, but it held the chilling promise of a coiled rattlesnake. Edwin, for all his bluster, was a creature of drawing rooms and courtrooms. He was not a man built for physical confrontation. He took a small step back, his composure cracking. He gave Nora one last look, a look that promised retribution, before turning on his heel and leaving the room. The moment he was gone, a tremor went through Nora's body. She felt drained, as if he had siphoned all the strength from her. She turned to Eli, 1,000 unsaid things in her eyes. He simply nodded, a gesture of understanding that went deeper than words. He knew a bully when he saw one. Later, in her room, the shame returned. The question that had haunted her for years echoed in her mind. What had she ever done to deserve such cruelty? And a newer, more terrifying question followed. What had she ever done to deserve the quiet decency of a man like Eli Hart? She felt unworthy of it, tainted by her past. The tension in Dry Gulch grew thick enough to choke on. That night, Danny Pike found Eli at the livery, his young face pale with fear. He had been sent to deliver a message to Edwin Roke's room and had lingered outside the door. He had heard Morrow's voice inside, loud and angry. "Morrow said the fire did not scare them enough," Danny whispered, his words tumbling out. He said they needed another lesson, a real one this time. He told Roke he was sending Twig to burn the old grist mill by the creek tonight. He said it would show the whole town what happens to people who get in the railroad's way. The threat galvanized them. There was no more time for doubt or debate. Nora found Preacher Bell in his small chapel, the air smelling of old paper and beeswax. She told him everything. The old man listened, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. His faith was a practical thing, rooted in the struggles of his flock. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "There are several ranchers who were swindled out of their land by Morrow," he said. "They were too afraid to speak up. Perhaps, if they see someone else with courage, they will find their own. I will go and talk to them. I will prepare their testimony." The plan was simple, desperate, and dangerous. Nora would take her camera to the old grist mill. Eli would be nearby, a silent guardian. They would not try to stop the fire. They would document it. They would catch Harlan Twig in the act, his face illuminated by the flames he set. It was their last, best chance to capture a truth that could not be denied. As night fell, a cold wind swept down from the mountains. Nora made her way to the abandoned mill, a hulking silhouette against a starless sky. She found a spot on a low ridge overlooking the building, shielded by a cluster of junipers. The camera felt impossibly heavy, the glass plates cold and fragile in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she set up the tripod. She was alone, a single point of defiance in a vast, hostile darkness. She was terrified. Then, across the dark valley, she saw it, a tiny spark of light, struck from a distance. It flared once, twice. It was Eli, signaling from his position on the opposite ridge. A flint striking steel, a small, man-made star in the oppressive blackness. He was there. He was watching. The two small lights, the steady glow of his signal and the imagined flash of her camera, were a conversation in the windy dark, a shared promise to hold the line. Her hand stopped shaking. She was ready. The silence by the old grist mill was a living thing, a heavy blanket woven from the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the creek. Nora waited, every nerve ending a taut wire. She was hidden, a ghost in the dark, her camera the only part of her that felt solid and real. Then, a new sound, the soft tread of a horse, followed by the squeak of saddle leather. A man dismounted, moving with a skulking confidence, even in the gloom. Nora recognized his lanky build and the hard-brimmed hat. Harlan Twig. He carried 2 large tins, and the air soon filled with the sharp, chemical smell of kerosene. He worked quickly, splashing the liquid against the dry, weathered wood of the mill. He was humming, a tuneless, discordant sound that made Nora's skin crawl. When he was finished, he stepped back to admire his work. He pulled a matchbox from his pocket, the one with the devil's face on it. He struck a match, the small flame flaring to life, illuminating his features in a brief, demonic glow. He was smiling. As he tossed the match, the world erupted. The kerosene ignited with a deep whoosh, and a wall of flame clawed its way up the side of the mill. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. Now, Nora triggered the flash pan. A silent, blinding explosion of magnesium light turned the night to day for one brilliant, frozen second. In that instant, everything was etched in perfect, stark detail: the roaring flames, the texture of the mill's wood, and the figure of Harlan Twig. his head turned toward the flash, his face a perfect mask of shock and rage, his distinctive hat a black halo around his head. The darkness that slammed back down felt even heavier than before. Twig let out a furious roar. He had seen her. He knew where she was. Nora's heart leaped into her throat as she fumbled to secure the exposed plate, her hand suddenly clumsy. She heard him crashing through the undergrowth, a beast drawn to the light. She had just managed to slide the plate holder into her satchel when he burst through the junipers. His face was contorted, his eyes wild in the firelight. "You!" he snarled, and lunged for her. He never reached her. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness, and Eli was there. He moved not with the brawling swagger of a saloon fighter, but with the deadly efficiency of a predator. He did not waste motion. He met Twig's clumsy rush with a hard shoulder to the man's chest, deflecting his momentum. The fight was a desperate, gasping affair in the dirt and shadows. There were no heroic speeches, only the ugly sounds of grunts, the thud of fists on flesh, and the ragged sound of two men fighting for dominance. Twig was bigger, fueled by a brute rage, but Eli was faster, smarter, using the uneven ground to his advantage. He sidestepped a wild swing and drove his fist into Twig's stomach. The air left the bigger man in a gust. As Twig staggered, Eli locked an arm around his neck, trying for a chokehold, but Twig was strong, and he drove Eli backward, slamming him against the trunk of a juniper. It was then that nature took a hand. The wind, which had been a steady breeze, suddenly shifted, gusting hard from the north. A great sheet of flame detached from the burning mill and roared toward them, carried on the superheated air. The dry grass and brush between them and the fire ignited instantly. Eli saw the danger. He broke his hold on Twig, shoving him hard to the side, and turned to Nora. "We have to go, now!" The fire was moving with terrifying speed, a rolling wave of orange and black. There was no time to run. Eli did not hesitate. He scooped Nora into his arms, her camera satchel banging against his back. He was all lean muscle and sinew, and he carried her as if she weighed nothing. He ran, not away from the fire, but parallel to it, heading for a rocky patch of ground where the flames would have less to feed on. A burning branch fell from a tree, showering them with embers. Eli shielded her head with his body, a sharp hiss escaping his lips as a piece of glowing wood landed on his exposed wrist. He did not stop until they reached the safety of the rocks, his breathing coming in deep, ragged gulps. He set her down gently, his face grim in the flickering light. He looked at his wrist. A nasty, angry burn was already beginning to blister on his skin. Before Nora could say anything, a new sound reached them, a high, terrified screaming. It was the sound of horses, in a small corral not 50 yards from the mill. A place they had not seen in the dark, were half a dozen animals, trapped and panicked by the approaching flames. Eli swore, a low, sharp sound. Without another thought, he started toward them. Nora was right behind him. They reached the wooden fence just as the fire licked at the far side. The horses were wild-eyed, crashing against the rails, working together. They unlatched the gate and drove the frantic animals out into the darkness, slapping their rumps and shouting until the last one had galloped to safety. They were saving lives, not because it was strategic, but because it was the right thing to do. Back in the relative safety of Dry Gulch, in the early hours before dawn, Nora worked in a makeshift darkroom she had created in the boarding house pantry. With May Hollis standing guard at the door, she mixed the chemicals by the light of a single red lantern. Her hands were steady now. She immersed the precious glass plate, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. Slowly, magically, the image began to appear. First, the ghostly outlines, then the deeper shadows. May leaned in, her breath held. "There," she whispered. Clear as day. It was perfect. Harlan Twig, caught in the act, his face illuminated, the logo on his hat visible. the flames rising behind him like the gates of hell. It was the truth, captured in silver and glass. May took the developed plate once it was dry. She wrapped it in a piece of soft velvet and opened a large, leather-bound box carved with a simple cross. Her late husband's Bible box. She placed the plate inside, nestled beside the worn, holy book. The good Lord appreciates a clear piece of evidence, she said, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. Let us see the sheriff argue with this. Eli came in then, his wrist bandaged with a strip of cloth Nora had torn from her petticoat. He looked from the Bible box to Nora's face, which was alight with a fierce, triumphant joy. He felt a powerful urge to close the distance between them, to put his arms around her and hold her, to share in the victory and shield her from what was still to come. But he held back. He saw the ghosts in her eyes, the lingering shadows of a past that had taught her to fear a man's touch. Respect was a line he would not cross. You have a habit of attracting trouble, he said instead, his voice a low rumble. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. Or maybe I am just good at getting a clear picture of it, she replied. The victory was short-lived. The next day, Silas Morrow's counterattack began. A team of surveyors arrived and drove a line of wooden stakes around the perimeter of Hart's Pocket, a stark, visual declaration of ownership. Worse, they used a team of horses and a plow to dig a deep trench, diverting the small creek that was Eli's only source of water. It was a slow, cruel siege. The true blow, however, fell that evening. It came in the form of a single, scuffed boy's shoe, left on the top step of the boarding house porch. May Hollis found it and let out a small cry. Nora recognized it instantly. It was Danny Pike's. A note was tucked inside, the words scrawled in a crude block script, a picture for a boy. Leave the camera by the old cottonwood at midnight. Come alone. They had taken Danny. The threat was no longer about land or law. It was personal. It was aimed at a child. Nora felt a fear colder and sharper than any she had known. But underneath it, something else was taking root. A hard, unyielding anger. This was her fault. Her investigation had put him in danger. Eli was a mask of cold fury. He checked his pistol, his movements spare and precise. I will go, he said. No, Nora said, her voice shaking but firm. They said, come alone. They want the camera. This is my fight. Her fear was still there, a living thing in her gut. But for the first time in her life, it was not in control. Her need to protect Danny was stronger. They argued, but she was immovable. In the end, they formed a plan. Nora would go, carrying her heavy camera box, but the box would be empty. Eli would follow, a ghost in the darkness, a last resort. At midnight, under the skeletal branches of the old cottonwood, she made the exchange. Harlan Twigg stepped out of the shadows, holding Danny by the collar of his shirt. The boy was trying to be brave, but his eyes were wide with terror. The camera, Twigg snarled. Nora placed the heavy wooden box on the ground and pushed it toward him. Twigg shoved Danny forward, and the boy scrambled to her side. Twigg snatched the box and melted back into the night. Nora wrapped her arms around Danny, holding the trembling boy close, her fear finally giving way to a wave of profound relief. She had faced the monster, and she had not broken. They had just returned to the warm light of the boarding house when heavy footsteps sounded on the porch. The front door opened without a knock, and Sheriff Kane filled the doorway. He was not smiling. May, he said, his voice flat. I have a warrant to search these premises for stolen property. Specifically, a photographic plate, which I have reason to believe was taken from the scene of the grist mill fire. May Hollis drew herself up to her full height. Sheriff, you will not find any stolen property in my house, only the word of God. Kane's eyes narrowed. He gestured to the carved Bible box on the mantelpiece. I will start by looking in there. May's expression was one of pure, grandmotherly offense. You wish to desecrate my late husband's Bible in my own home." She did not move, her presence a formidable, moral obstacle. "The law's the law," Kane said, taking a step forward. "Now give me the box." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As Kane reached a hand toward the mantel, there was a soft, polite knock on Nora's room door. Just at the top of the stairs, everyone looked up. Standing there, his face a picture of concerned inquiry, was Edwin Roque. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I heard shouting." Edwin Roque's unexpected appearance in the common room had the effect of a stone dropped into a still pond. The tense standoff between Sheriff Kane and May Hollis dissolved into a confused, awkward silence. Kane, who relied on blunt intimidation, seemed momentarily wrong-footed by the arrival of a man in a tailored suit, a man who was clearly allied with his own employer. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Sheriff," Edwin said, his voice a smooth balm on the raw nerves in the room, "I was just concerned there was some trouble." Kane shot a venomous glare at May, then at Nora, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs. "No trouble, Mr. Roque," he said, forcing a semblance of official composure. "Just a routine inquiry." He seemed to realize that pressing his search in front of the railroad's own lawyer would look clumsy and overzealous. He clapped his hat back on his head. "We will conclude this matter in the morning." He turned and strode out, his deputies trailing behind him like pilot fish. Edwin offered Nora a small, triumphant smile, a look that said, "See how I can make your problems disappear." The look made her stomach churn. She turned without a word and went back into her room, closing the door behind her. The click of the latch felt like a gunshot in the silent house. An hour later, the boarding house had settled into a fitful quiet. Nora found Eli in the livery stable, the air thick with the peaceful, earthy smells of hay and horses. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a cathedral of solitude. He was sitting on a wooden crate, his back against a stall, staring at his bandaged wrist as if it were a foreign object. The fire, the chase, the rescue of Danny, and the ugly confrontation had finally caught up to them, leaving a residue of exhaustion and frayed nerves. She carried a small basin of clean water and a fresh cloth. She knelt in the straw in front of him without a word, taking his arm gently. He did not resist. The crude bandage she had tied on him was already stained. She carefully unwound it, revealing the angry red skin of the burn. It was a nasty wound, already blistering in the center, a painful testament to his reflexive act of shielding her. The lantern light was a warm, isolated pool in the vast darkness of the stable. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the horses in their stalls and the gentle splash of water as Nora dipped the cloth. Her touch was feather-light, her movements deliberate and focused. She cleaned the soot and grime from around the burn, her brow furrowed in concentration. They were so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the slight tremor in his hand as she worked. The air was charged, filled with everything that had been left unsaid between them. When she finished cleaning the wound, she looked up, her eyes meeting his in the flickering light. His gaze was steady, watchful, and filled with a quiet concern that had nothing to do with his own pain. That look, so unlike the possessive, appraising stare of Edwin Roque, was what finally broke the dam inside her. "He used to tell me I was too emotional," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Edwin, he said I felt things too deeply, that it made me unstable, unreliable." Eli remained silent, listening. He did not nod or offer empty platitudes. He just listened, giving her the space she needed. "He was a lawyer," she continued, her gaze dropping back to his wrist. "Very handsome, very charming. My father adored him. He said Edwin would take care of me, and for a while, I believed it. He made me feel like the most brilliant, beautiful woman in the world. But it was a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage. Every compliment had a price. Every gift was a new bar on the door. He started by correcting my opinions in public, always with a smile, making it seem like a joke. Then he started to choose my friends, then my clothes. He said it was because he wanted the world to see me as he saw me. Perfect. She paused, taking a shaky breath. The truth was, he wanted the world to see me as his, a possession. When I started to pull away, when I told him I wanted to pursue my photography seriously, he changed. The charm became a weapon. He told me my pictures were a vulgar hobby, that I was embarrassing him. He threatened to tell my father I was mentally unwell. And when I finally packed my bags to leave, he showed me what he had done. He had taken pictures of me. Private pictures. Moments I had shared with him in what I thought was trust. He told me that if I walked out that door, he would show them to everyone. He would create a story, a scandal. He would ruin me. Tears she had refused to shed for years now tracked silently down her dusty cheeks. It was not just the threat, Eli. It was the shame. He made me feel dirty, as if I had done something wrong. He took my trust and twisted it into a weapon to hold over my head. I ran. I just ran. And I have been running ever since. I came out here because I thought no one would ever find me. I thought I could build a life where I was just me, not his victim. She finished her story, and a profound silence descended, broken only by the soft stamp of a horse's hoof. She had laid her deepest wound bare. She felt raw, exposed, and terribly fragile. Eli watched her, his heart a tight, painful knot in his chest. A primitive, violent anger rose in him, a desire to find this man, Roke, and break him with his bare hands, but he pushed it down. That was his instinct. The man's instinct to protect, to fight, to solve. But he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that was not what she needed. She had not told him her story so he could fight her battles. She had told him so he would see her, all of her, the strength and the scars. He found his voice, and it was rough with an emotion he could not name. I do not want to be a shadow that covers you, Nora, he said slowly. Just a shoulder, if you want it. She looked up at him then, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. She saw the truth of his words in his face. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to stand with her while she saved herself. The quiet strength of that offer, the profound respect in it, was more than she had ever dared to hope for. A small, watery smile touched her lips. She reached out and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. He was so real, so solid, a grounding presence in a world that had always felt like shifting sand. You do not gotta say you love me, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The words hung in the air, a breathtaking act of trust. It was an absolution and an invitation. A muscle worked in Eli's jaw. He raised his uninjured hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear. His touch was warm and steady. Then let me show you, he said, his voice a low murmur. He tilted her chin, a gesture of infinite tenderness, and then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate need. It was slow and deep and profoundly gentle. It was a kiss that spoke of comfort, of acceptance, of a quiet, unshakable truth. It was a promise, not of forever, but of right now. It was a promise to be a safe harbor in the storm. When they finally broke apart, the air in the stable seemed to hum. The world had shifted on its axis. Nora rested her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the cool air. The raw vulnerability she had felt was gone, replaced by a quiet, glowing warmth. She pulled back a little, a mischievous light returning to her eyes. You kiss like you make coffee, she murmured. He raised a questioning eyebrow. A little bitter at first, she teased gently, but it ends up being warm. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. A rare and wonderful thing. It transformed his stern features, making him look younger. "I will practice making both better," he promised. The comfortable intimacy that settled between them was a fragile, precious thing. As she rebandaged his wrist, she used her own red silk scarf, the one she had worn as armor against Edwin. Now, its bright color was a splash of life against the white cloth, a symbol transformed from one of defiance to one of shared care. Outside, beyond the warm circle of lantern light, the night was not as peaceful. Two figures stood in the deep shadows cast by the general store, their voices low and urgent. Sheriff Kane was reporting to Silas Morrow, who had just arrived on a late train. His face a thundercloud of fury. "He lost the camera box," Morrow hissed, his voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "That idiot Twig lost the only leverage we had." Kane shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the man's cold rage. He got the boy back. What was he supposed to do? Morrow paced, his polished boots crunching in the dirt. "This photographer is the problem. Her and that half-breed protector of hers. We cannot burn them all out. We need a cleaner way. We need the law." Kane straightened up, seeing his opportunity. "The photographic plate from the mill, she took it. That is evidence. That is theft." Morrow stopped pacing. "Theft of evidence," he mused, a cruel smile touching his lips. And her presence at the fire, her flash pan. She could be accused of inciting a riot, creating a public disturbance. "It is thin, but it is enough. Get a warrant. I want her arrested. I want her and that plate locked up by sunrise. Then we will see how brave she is." The day broke not with light, but with a strange, pearlescent grayness that pressed down on the sky. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, died away into an unnerving stillness. A deep, unnatural cold seeped into the bones of Dry Gulch, a cold that had nothing to do with the season. Then, the first flake of snow drifted down, a perfect, six-sided star that melted on the dusty ground. It was followed by another, and then 100, and then 1,000,000. Within an hour, the world had vanished. Replaced by a blinding, vertical torrent of white, the unseasonal blizzard fell upon the Wyoming territory like a judgment, a great white sheet thrown over the sins and struggles of the land. The town ground to a halt. The world shrank to the space between one building and the next. The wind returned with a vengeance, a screaming banshee that drove the snow into deep, impassable drifts. It was a force of nature that rendered all human plans insignificant. But Silas Morrow was not a man to be deterred by a storm. They appeared out of the swirling white void like specters, two dark figures marching with grim purpose. Morrow, wrapped in a fine wool coat, his face set like granite, and Sheriff Kane, his bulk braced against the wind, a sheaf of official papers clutched in his hand. They did not knock on the boarding house door. Kane simply slammed it open, letting a blast of wind and snow into the warm common room. A small group had taken refuge there: May Hollis, Preacher Bell, the Vargas family, and Danny Pike, all huddled near the pot-bellied stove. Nora and Eli stood near the back, having just come in from a futile attempt to secure the livery stable doors. "Nora Vale," Kane bellowed, shaking snow from his hat. "I have a warrant for your arrest." On what charge? Nora's voice was steady, a small point of calm in the storm. "Destruction of private property, inciting a public disturbance, and theft of evidence," he recited, a smug satisfaction in his tone. He brandished the papers. "And Eli Hart. This is the final order of seizure for the property known as Hart's Pocket, for failure to pay outstanding territorial taxes. We will be escorting you both to the town jail." Morrow stepped forward, his cold eyes sweeping the room. "This is a simple matter of law and order. The Frontier and Spur Railroad cannot have its work impeded by troublemakers and delinquents. I suggest you all return to your homes and let the sheriff do his duty." It was Preacher Bell who spoke first. He was an old man, but his voice, though quiet, filled the room with an unshakable authority. The law is a tool. Mr. Morrow, he said, rising slowly to his feet. It can be used to build a house, or it can be used as a hammer to break a man's back. The good book tells us to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It does not tell us to let Caesar steal what is ours. A murmur went through the small crowd. The town, for days, had been a place of whispers and divided loyalties. Now, in the confines of this room, with the storm raging outside, the division became a visible line in the sand. May Hollis moved then. Without a word, she walked to the mantelpiece, picked up her late husband's Bible box, and carried it to the center of the room. She placed it on top of a large cracker barrel with a solid, definitive thud. The gesture was a challenge, a public declaration. The truth is here. Kane's face darkened with rage. He started toward her, but the door burst open again. Harlan Twigg stumbled in, his face pale, followed by Edwin Roque, who looked profoundly unhappy to be in the middle of this crude, provincial drama. "Just in time," Morrow said with a thin smile. "Mr. Twigg will be signing a complaint against Miss Vale for endangering his life at the grist mill fire." The trap was closing. Nora felt a familiar, cold spike of fear, but as she looked at Eli, at May's defiant stance, at the frightened but resolute face of Miguel Vargas, the fear was crowded out by something else, a cold, clear anger. "Let us have some light on the matter," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. She moved to the window and pulled down a simple, white linen sheet that served as a curtain, handing one end to Eli. "Hold this." She opened her satchel, not for a weapon, but for a simple wooden frame holding a piece of glass. Her lens. She took the lantern from the center table and placed it on a small stool, positioning it behind the lens. The room fell silent, watching her strange preparations. She then retrieved the Bible box, opened it, and took out the glass plate. Negative. "What is this nonsense?" Kane demanded. "This," Nora said, her voice clear and strong, "is called evidence." She slid the negative into a slot in front of the lantern. A ghostly, inverted image bloomed on the white sheet, a building wreathed in roaring flames, and silhouetted against the fire. A man. The image was grainy, ethereal, but the shape of the hard-brimmed hat was unmistakable, and his face, turned toward the light, was a pale mask of shock. At that exact moment, a gust of wind rattled a set of tin wind chimes on the porch, a sound like a flurry of metallic applause. "It proves nothing," Twigg snarled, his eyes wide. "It proves you were there," Nora said. Edwin Roque took a step forward, his face a mask of condescending pity. "Nora, this is madness. You're hysterical." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled, anonymous letter. "This is what this is about. Is it not, these absurd, paranoid fantasies? Well, let us put an end to them." With a theatrical flourish, he ripped the letter into pieces and threw them to the floor. A dead silence fell over the room. No one understood the gesture except Nora. It was the letter she had received in Cheyenne, the one that had first warned her of Morrow, the one Edwin had sent to try and scare her away, by destroying it in front of everyone. He had just confessed. Danny Pike's young voice cut through the silence like a knife. "I heard him. He was with Mr. Morrow, in his room. He said he sent you letters. He said he would ruin you." Edwin's face went white. The color drained from his cheeks as if he had been struck. Twigg panicked. He saw the tide turning, the hunters becoming the hunted. He clawed a pistol from under his coat, but before he could raise it, Eli was moving. He launched himself at Twigg, not in a charge, but in a low, controlled slide on the slick, snow-melted floorboards. The icy surface that should have been a disadvantage became his ally. He slammed into Twigg's legs, taking him down in a tangle of limbs. The pistol flew from Twigg's hand, skittering across the floor. Sheriff Kane saw his chance. His own gun appeared in his hand, and he aimed it squarely at Eli, who was struggling to subdue the larger man. Morrow's voice was a whip crack. "Kane." No, not like this. Think of the reports, the investors. His words were not a plea for mercy, but a cold, economic calculation. A messy killing was bad for business. In that split second of hesitation, Nora moved. She did not scream or faint. She stepped directly in front of Eli, shielding his body with her own. She held up another photograph, a smaller one, a print she had made from the shattered plate at the Vargas fire. It was just a shard of an image, but it was damningly clear. It showed the unique, devil-faced logo on Harlan Twig's hat, and in the background, a partial view of the Vargas barn with its distinctive weather vane. "Look at it," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. She was no longer speaking to Kane or Morrow. She was speaking to her neighbors. "Look at his hat. Look at the Vargas barn. This is not about the law. This is about your homes, your lives. Who will be next?" Her words, calm and reasoned, broke the spell of fear. Miguel Vargas, his face still pale from the fire, stepped forward. "He burned my home," he said, his voice shaking with a righteous anger. "I saw him." Then May Hollis spoke. "He tried to force me to sell this house for half its worth." Then another rancher, and another, a chorus of accusation, of long-suppressed grievances finally brought into the light. The moral foundation of Kane's authority crumbled into dust. Two of his own deputies, their faces grim, took a step back from him, turning their shoulders away in a silent, profound act of renunciation. Kane saw it was over. He made a desperate run for the door, but his heavy boots slipped on a patch of ice just on the threshold. His feet went out from under him, and he went down hard, his head cracking against the doorframe. Before he could recover, one of his former deputies was on him, snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. Morrow alone seemed unfazed. He straightened his coat. "This is a local matter. It will be settled by federal marshals," he said with cold disdain. "I do not think so," said a quiet voice from the back of the room. It was the postmaster, a mousy man named Abernathy, who was holding a stack of mail. "I have here a signed affidavit from a postal inspector in Cheyenne, confirming that several freight manifests you signed, Mr. Morrow, were fraudulent. Using the United States mail to defraud is a federal offense. I believe the marshals will be more interested in talking to you." Morrow's composure finally shattered. For the first time, Nora saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. At that moment, a deep, resonant sound tolled through the town. The bell in Preacher Bell's chapel, pulled by an unknown hand, began to ring, a slow, solemn peal of victory. And as if in response to the bell, the wind died down. The blinding snow softened into a gentle, quiet fall. Through the window, Nora could see a patch of blue sky. The storm was breaking. Nature itself seemed to be nodding in approval. In the aftermath of the storm, both meteorological and human, a profound quiet settled over Dry Gulch. The snow, a clean white bandage over the wounded land, muffled all sound. The world seemed to be holding its breath. From the chaos of the confrontation emerged a new, unexpected center of gravity. Deputy June Alder. She was a quiet, capable woman in her late 30s, who had served under Kane with a stoicism that many had mistaken for meekness. It was not, with Kane incapacitated and Morrow and his associates under guard. She took command with an authority that was all the more powerful for its lack of bluster. Her first act was to send a long, detailed telegraph to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. She laid out the facts without embellishment: the arson, the fraudulent land claims, the mail fraud, the arrest of a sheriff and a railroad agent. Her second act was to deal with Harlan Twig. She did not interrogate him in a cell. She sat him down in the common room of the boarding house, now serving as a makeshift command center, and had May Hollis place a cup of hot, steaming coffee in front of him. Twig was a cornered animal, his brute force useless against the calm, methodical questions of the deputy. He saw no escape, only a long, dark road to a territorial prison. He began to talk, not in a flood, but in a slow, grudging trickle that soon became a torrent. He confessed to setting both fires, confirming that Silas Morrow had paid him, that Sheriff Kane had promised him protection, and that the lawyer, Roque, had been present during the planning, offering legal advice on how to make it all look like an accident. He sang, as May later put it, like a canary in a coal mine, hoping a song of confession would earn him a slightly less dismal cage. With every name he uttered, another nail was hammered into the coffins of Morrow's and Kane's power. While the machinery of the law began to grind, a quieter, more personal restoration was taking place. Later that day, in the warm kitchen of the boarding house, Nora once again tended to Eli's burn. The red silk scarf was stained and she replaced it with a clean linen dressing, her touch gentle and practiced. His skin was hot to the touch, the wound a stark reminder of the fire they had walked through together. When she was finished, he looked not at his own injury, but at the dark, bruise-like circles of exhaustion under her eyes. "You need to rest," he said, his voice a low command. "I am fine," she began, but he was already on his feet, ladling a thin, savory porridge May had left simmering on the stove into a bowl. He placed it in her hands. "Eat," he said, "then sleep. Later." She awoke on a cot in a small spare room to find he had draped a heavy wool blanket over her. He had also brought in a fresh stack of firewood for the small stove, a silent act of care that spoke more loudly than any declaration. It was in these small, simple gestures that a new language was forming between them. Not the grand, sweeping passion of the stories she had once read, but something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more real. It was the language of a shared future, spoken in acts of simple, daily kindness. Out in the town, the citizens of Dry Gulch were finding their own voice. The fear that had kept them silent for so long had been cauterized by the fire and the snow. Preacher Bell, with Miguel Vargas at his side, went from door to door with a petition. It demanded that the town council formally recognize the water rights of the small landowners and establish a community charter to prevent any single entity, railroad or otherwise, from ever again seizing control of their lifeblood. People signed eagerly, their signatures a collective act of reclamation. In the town hall, Deputy Alder unrolled the official territorial map, and with a small crowd of ranchers looking on, she took a pen and drew a firm, clear line in ink, nullifying the fraudulent survey markers and officially restoring the original boundaries of Hart's Pocket. The paper prison had been torn down. Nora, rested and restored, found her own purpose taking root again. She sat at a large oak table in the common room, her notebooks and pens spread before her. The story that had been a confusing, dangerous puzzle was now clear in her mind. She began to write, the words flowing from her pen with a clarity and force she had never known. She was not just a reporter. She was a witness. As she wrote, Danny Pike watched her, his young face a mixture of awe and curiosity. He had been quiet since his ordeal, but his eyes followed Nora's every move. She paused in her writing and looked at him. "Would you like to learn?" she asked softly. He nodded, a shy, eager gesture. She took him into the pantry, her makeshift darkroom, and by the light of the red lantern, she began to show him the magic. She explained the chemistry, the delicate process of coating and sensitizing a glass plate. She let him handle the heavy wooden camera, showing him how the lens gathered light, how the bellows focused the truth. It was more than a lesson in photography. It was a transfer of a legacy, a passing of a torch. She was giving him a way to see the world, and to make the world see. The final piece of Nora's past fell away with the arrival of another telegraph. It was for Edwin Roque, his esteemed law firm in the East, having been appraised of the federal mail fraud investigation and the litany of local complaints, had formally withdrawn their representation. A second, more personal message followed. A warrant had been issued for him in his home state, based on a new complaint filed by a woman who had read of his arrest, a woman he had victimized years before. His web of intimidation had finally unraveled. Nora felt no triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of release. The ghost that had haunted her steps for so long had finally been banished, not by a knight in shining armor, but by the simple, cumulative weight of the truth. That afternoon, Eli rode out to Hart's Pocket. The land was serene under its blanket of fresh snow, the ugly survey stakes looking like pathetic, misplaced toothpicks. He spent the rest of the day in a steady, solitary rhythm of repair. He broke the earthen dam Morrow's men had built, and with a joyful gurgle, the creek returned to its rightful course, its clear water flowing once more toward his struggling apple trees. Then, he turned his attention to the front gate. He pulled the thick nail from the post where the condemnation notice had been hung. He found a new, solid length of pine and began to mend the broken fence. The work was simple, honest, and deeply satisfying. With every swing of the hammer, he was not just repairing a fence. He was rebuilding the walls of his own life, mending a breach that had been made long before Silas Morrow had ever heard his name. He was restoring his home. As dusk settled, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the residents of the boarding house gathered in the common room. The tension of the past weeks had finally dissipated, replaced by a warm, weary camaraderie. May Hollis poured Eli a cup of coffee, her eyes twinkling. She took a small sip from her own cup, then looked at his. "Well now," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "I do believe this is the first cup you have made that does not taste like you are trying to strip paint." A ripple of laughter went through the room, a warm, genuine sound of release. Eli even cracked a small smile, a rare and welcome sight. The peace was new, fragile, but it was real. They had earned it. Nora stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was ablaze with a fiery, impossible red, the color of her silk scarf, the color of defiance and of healing. The wind was gentle now, a soft whisper through the cottonwoods. The temporary peace felt solid, hard-won. The silence was no longer heavy with threat, but full of a quiet, hopeful promise. A week after the blizzard, the world was reborn. The snow had begun to melt under a surprisingly warm sun, and the prairie, washed clean of its dust, steamed in the afternoon light. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and new beginnings in this quiet, healing interlude. Eli Hart made a trip to the blacksmith's shop, not for a horseshoe or a repaired tool, but for a small, private commission. He did not have much to offer, but he traded a finely braided leather bridle of his own making for a simple, unadorned silver ring. He spent that evening in his own small workshop, with a set of fine engraving tools his father had left him, by the light of a single, steady lamp. He carefully etched 3 small words into the soft metal of the band: "Keep the light." It was a prayer, a promise, and a tribute to the woman who had brought the truth into focus. That night, a sliver of a new moon hung in the inky, star-dusted sky. He found Nora on the porch of the boarding house, watching the constellations emerge. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. He did not have to say where. She simply nodded, pulling on a warm shawl. And they walked in a comfortable silence out of the quiet town and toward the gentle slope of Hart's Pocket. The ground was soft underfoot, and the air was still and cold. They stopped beneath the sprawling branches of the old cottonwood tree, the place where they had first stood as wary allies, their backs to the world. Now, they stood facing each other in its protective shadow. Eli's hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy. He took a deep breath, the cold air a sharp sting in his lungs. He was a man accustomed to the language of tracking, of horses, of the wind. The language of the heart was a foreign, difficult country. He decided to speak the only way he knew how, with plain, unvarnished truth. "Nora," he began, his voice a low, serious rumble in the quiet night. "I am not a man who has much. This land, these 2 hands, that is most of it. I cannot promise you a life without hardship. The winters here are long, and the summers are dry. There will always be fences to mend and debts to pay. He paused, his dark eyes searching her face in the faint moonlight. I cannot promise to always have the right words. Most times, I probably will not. But I can promise to stand by you while you find yours. I can promise to listen, even when I do not understand. I can promise that my back will be a shield for you, if you need it. I want to build a life here. I want to watch these apple trees grow, and I do not want to do it alone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver ring. It gleamed, a circle of captured moonlight in his calloused palm. He did not kneel. He simply stood before her, an equal, and held it out. Nora looked from the ring to his earnest, vulnerable face. Her heart felt impossibly full, a warm, swelling tide of an emotion so pure and strong it almost took her breath away. All her life, men had promised her the world, promised to protect her, to perfect her, to own her. Eli Hart was the first man who had ever simply promised to stand beside her. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. She met his serious gaze with a playful, familiar spark. "Is this a formal proposal?" she asked, her voice laced with a gentle, teasing humor. Eli's brow furrowed for a second before he understood. "Yes," he said, his own lips twitching into a reluctant smile. "I believe it is." "Well then, I have some conditions," she said, her tone growing mock serious. "First, do you swear that you will, to the best of your ability, learn to make coffee that does not taste like a punishment?" He let out a short, surprised laugh, a sound of pure relief. "I swear." "And do you promise to never, ever try to help me wash my photographic plates again? You almost ruined my best image of the grist mill fire with your enthusiastic rinsing." "I promise to stay at least 10 feet away from your chemicals at all times," he said, his smile now broad and genuine. She laughed, a bright, happy sound that seemed to make the stars shine a little brighter. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and placed her hand over his, curling her fingers around the small silver ring. "Then my answer is yes, Eli Hart." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He did not kiss her then. Instead, he took her hand in both of his, a gesture of profound respect. She stepped closer and rested her forehead against his, a silent communion that was more intimate than any embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, two solitary figures who had found their home in each other, their shared breath misting in the cold night air. She had not said yes because he had saved her. She had said yes because he had seen her, truly seen her, and had not asked her to be anyone but the woman she was. It was then that a new light began to bloom at the edge of the valley, a single golden spark, down by the newly mended fence, then another and another, until a long, glowing line of light traced the border of Hart's pocket. Nora and Eli turned to watch, their hands still clasped. Down below, they could see a small group of figures moving along the fence line, their task complete. May Hollis, holding a lantern high, Preacher Bell, his silhouette unmistakable, the Vargas family, working together, and young Danny Pike, carefully placing the last lamp on a fence post before turning to wave up at them. It was a silent, beautiful celebration, a town-style engagement party, a circle of light drawn by their chosen family, a testament that justice, humanity, and love were not separate things, but threads woven together to make a single, strong cord. Nora felt tears well in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Look," she whispered. Eli squeezed her hand. "I see it." She felt a familiar, professional urge. "Wait here," she said, and hurried back toward the town. She returned minutes later, breathless, carrying her heavy camera and tripod. She set it up beside him, right there under the cottonwood tree, pointing it out at the valley. "This time, you stand with me," she said. He stood beside her, his shoulder just brushing hers. As she ducked under the focusing cloth, she was going to take another long exposure. He watched, not as a subject in her frame, but as a partner at her side. She uncapped the lens, and the glass plate began its slow, silent work of drinking in the light. In the final image, the long line of storm lanterns would not be individual points of flame, but a single, brilliant ribbon of starlight, a man-made constellation on the dark Wyoming earth. As the camera gathered the light, the sound of soft, distant laughter drifted up from the valley floor. It was May, telling a story, her voice carrying on the still night air. It was the sound of peace, of community, of a future taking root. The night was finally quiet. There was no more sound of hammers on steel, no threatening rumble of a train that took more than it gave. There was only the whisper of the wind in the cottonwood, and the steady, quiet beat of two hearts that had found their place. The winter of 1889 gave way to the spring of 1890, with a slow, steady thaw that felt like a collective exhalation. The land, freed from its bondage of snow and ice, revealed the tender green shoots of new life. In the territorial capital of Cheyenne, the wheels of justice, which had once seemed so rusted and immovable, turned with a surprising swiftness. The trial of Silas Morrow and Luther Kane was the talk of the territory. Nora's photographs, presented as evidence, were stark, irrefutable, and damning. Harlan Twig's detailed confession, along with the testimonies of the ranchers from Dry Gulch, painted a picture of corporate greed and legal corruption so blatant that a conviction was all but assured. Morrow was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and intimidation, sentenced to a long term in a federal penitentiary where his wealth and influence could not buy his freedom. Kane, stripped of his badge and his bluster, received a lesser but still substantial sentence for his role in the conspiracy and abuse of his office. He was a broken man, a hollow shell of the authority he had once wielded. Far away in the east, the news of the verdict in Wyoming reached Edwin Roque, who was already embroiled in his own legal troubles. The testimony of the woman his threats had silenced for years, emboldened by Nora's courage, proved to be a powerful indictment. Faced with irrefutable evidence of his long history of manipulation and coercion, he was convicted. The cage of threats and shame he had built for Nora had ultimately become his own. For Nora, the news was not a moment of triumph, but of quiet closure, a final, heavy door swinging shut on a dark chapter of her life. The wedding was held on a bright, clear afternoon in late April, under the sheltering branches of the old cottonwood tree at Hart's Pocket. It was a simple affair, marked not by pomp, but by a deep and abiding sense of peace. Nora wore a simple cream-colored dress, her only adornment the silver ring on her finger. Eli stood beside her, his usual worn denim replaced by a clean work shirt, his dark hair tied back with a new leather thong. He looked not so much transformed as settled, a man who had finally found his true north. Preacher Bell officiated, his words not taken from a book, but from the heart, speaking of resilience, of finding shelter in a storm, and of the quiet courage it takes to build a home. May Hollis stood as Nora's witness, her broad, kind face beaming. Miguel Vargas, his own home now being rebuilt with the help of his neighbors, stood with Eli. And behind a large, heavy camera, mounted on a sturdy tripod, stood Danny Pike. His eye was pressed to the viewfinder, his young face a mask of intense concentration. As Preacher Bell pronounced them husband and wife, Danny uncapped the lens, capturing the moment not as a silent, posed tableau, but as a living, breathing instant. He caught the slow, gentle kiss, the brilliant smile on Nora's face, and the rare, unguarded joy in Eli's eyes. The torch had not just been passed. It was now burning brightly in a new pair of hands. A few weeks later, a bundle of newspapers arrived on the morning stage. On the front page of the Territorial Gazette, under a bold, striking headline, was Nora's story. She had called it Ashes on the Rail. It was not a sensationalist piece. It was a clear, unblinking account of the human cost of unchecked ambition. She told the stories of the Vargas family, of the ranchers who had been intimidated, of a town that had been slowly strangled by fear. Her photographs, beautifully reproduced as engravings, gave a face to the victims and a stark reality to the crimes. The article did not paint heroes or villains in simple strokes, but rather explored the complex, often murky territory where progress and humanity collided. It was a piece of journalism that did more than report the facts. It revealed the truth. Life in Hart's Pocket settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. The small cabin was expanded. A new room built to serve as Nora's permanent darkroom and studio. But the valley became more than just a home. With its water restored and its boundaries secure, it became a sanctuary. They opened their land as a way station, a place for travelers on the long, lonely road to rest their horses and get a hot meal. May Hollis, who had sold the boarding house to a young family, came out 3 days a week to oversee the kitchen, her booming laughter and pragmatic kindness becoming the heart of the place. Preacher Bell, with a donation of books from a church in Cheyenne, established a small lending library in a corner of the main room, a quiet testament to the idea that a community needed to feed its mind as well as its body. Nora, no longer a fugitive from her past, had become the woman she was always meant to be. An artist, a storyteller, a wife. Her work was her own. Her voice clear and strong. Her value determined not by any man, but by the truth and beauty she created. She had learned to trust not only others, but herself. Eli, in turn, had shed the protective shell of his isolation. The wariness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet confidence. He was no longer just the half-Cheyenne scout, a man living on the margins. He was Eli Hart, a husband, a landowner, a respected pillar of the community he had helped to save. He had opened his heart, not just to Nora, but to the idea that he could belong, that his mixed heritage was not a source of conflict, but a source of strength. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home, Nora hung a framed photograph on the wall. It was the long exposure she had taken the night of their engagement, the image of the storm lanterns forming a brilliant ribbon of light along the fence line. Beneath it, she had affixed a small, hand-lettered card. It read, "All light is cast by a hand that holds it." It was the closing statement of her creed, a belief in the power of community, in the idea that hope was not a passive thing, but an act of collective will. Danny Pike came running up the path then, waving a letter in his hand, his face alight with a joy so pure it was contagious. It was a letter from the editor of the Territorial Gazette, the man who had published Nora's story. He had been so impressed with Danny's photograph of the wedding, which Nora had sent along with her article, that he was offering the boy a scholarship, a chance to travel, to study, to learn the craft of photography from one of the best practitioners in the West. It was a promise of a future, a bright, shining path opening up from the dusty streets of Dry Gulch. As the sun set, painting the sky in the familiar, fiery colors of a Wyoming evening, the sound of the evening train drifted up from the valley, but it was different now. The train, under new local management, slowed as it passed the small town, its whistle blowing not a warning, but a greeting. It was no longer a relentless, devouring machine. It was just a train, a part of the landscape, serving the community instead of preying on it. Eli reached out and took Nora's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They stood together, watching the lights of the train recede into the twilight, knowing that the future, like the mending of a fence or the development of a photograph, was a slow and patient work they would always do together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.